G'day, it's Jimmy Bartell.
And Bruce Eva. Our podcast, Yesterday's Heroes, covers all sports.
Honestly, what are you bringing to the table, Beaver?
The knowledge.
Let's test it. How many test wickets did Uak McGrath take?
563.
How many laps around Mount Panorama?
I told you this the other week, 161.
As usual, I wasn't listening to you. Who's winning the Ashes?
Well, that's up to us to debate.
No debate. We'll absolutely romp it in, so listen to me for your tips.
And to me to sound sports smart.
Well, listen to both of us. Subscribe to Yesterday's Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
New episodes every Thursday, thanks to PointsBet.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, May 26.
A government business, order of the day number 1, Constitution alteration, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice 2023, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill...
The week in Parliament has been dominated by debate over the Indigenous voice to Parliament. The legislation enabling the voice referendum was introduced to the House of Representatives, and more than 80 MPs spoke during the debate on the bill's second reading.
It's one of the most important decisions Australians will make in their lifetime. Because if Australians vote for change, then our nation, our democracy and their lives will be fundamentally altered.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton kicked off the debate with a no-holds-barred attack on the proposal, saying it would re-racialise Australia and would have an Orwellian effect, making some Australians more equal than others.
The voice, as proposed by the Prime Minister, promotes difference, and it's sadly a symptom of the madness of identity politics which has infected the 21st century. The voice will re-racialise our nation. At a time when we need to unite the country, this Prime Minister's proposal will permanently divide us by race.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese used his speech to denounce the remarks made by Dutton. He accused the Leader of the Opposition of seeking to amplify misinformation about the voice.
Those exhausted cliches of Orwell and identity politics, the ongoing conceit that there is apparently no inequality in Australia now, no legacy of discrimination, no disadvantage to address, no gap to close.
Albanese said that the fact that our national story stretches back 65,000 years is something our nation's birth certificate should recognise and celebrate.
The fact that we share this island continent with the world's oldest continuous culture is a source of pride for all of us.
So what were the developments in the debate this week? How is all this argument in Canberra affecting support for voice in the community? And what are the prospects of success for the referendum? Today, federal political reporter Lisa Vicentin and chief political correspondent David Crowe join me to discuss the week in politics. Welcome, Lisa and David.
Thanks for having us.
Great to talk again.
Lisa and David, both of you have been following this week's debate very closely. For those not paying close attention, what exactly has happened in Parliament this week? Lisa, do you want to tell us?
So the debate on the referendum bill, the bill that will basically authorise the referendum later this year, sometime between October and December, has kicked off in the Parliament. There have been somewhere close to 100 speakers, so it has gone on all week. And we just saw yesterday Anthony Albanese speak on The Voice. He focused his speech on really taking opposition leader Peter Dutton to task over his speech on the bill earlier in the week, where he said, you know, he's obviously opposed to The Voice. He used some very strong language to say that The Voice would re-racialise Australia. It would divide the country along the lines of race. He invoked Orwell to suggest that it would make some Australians more equal than others. So Mr Albanese gave a pretty strident denunciation of this as misinformation and catastrophising, and said that that kind of language was really unworthy of an alternative Prime Minister.
David, just stepping back one loop in this debate, listeners might have heard there's been some debate over whether or not to include the words executive government in the proposed amendment. Can you remind us what that's about?
It's basically about what the voice can do and how much influence it can have on government. The basic principle behind the voice is that it's a voice from Indigenous leaders who represent the Indigenous community, and it's a voice to Parliament. That means it can make representations to Parliament. It can make representations to ministers, given they're members of Parliament. But there's wording in the constitutional change that says it can make representations to executive government. And the interesting feedback here is that we know that some of the campaigners are getting questions, well, what is executive government, right? So there are many assumptions made about what this all means to ordinary Australians. But basically it's about giving advice to government agencies and departments, not just to the minister. Now, some critics say this goes too far, that it'll bog down departments and agencies in red tape. But I think what's most important this week is the Yes side doesn't believe that that is a real clincher for the wider population. They don't believe that ordinary Australians really care that much about that principle. So even though it's something that is creating legalistic debate, it's not going to matter much in the final campaign, according to the Yes campaigners. And this is sort of a crucial decision that they've made. So even though we're getting a lot of debate in Parliament this week, and we'll get it again next week, and then in the Senate in June, we're not seeing any fundamental movement on this basic issue. So the principle that's being put forward to change the Constitution is going through the House, and I think will go through the Senate, pretty much in the form that it was set out weeks ago. So with all the speeches going on, there's not a fundamental movement in either side.
Lisa, there are some people on the Liberal side, on the opposition side, who are pushing at this late stage to have the wording of the amendment changed. Who are those people, and are they likely to get their way?
The main proponent is Liberal MP Julian Leeser. He was formerly the Shadow Attorney General, and he obviously quit that position so that he could advocate for a yes position on The Voice. But he wants to take out Clause 2 of the amendment, which has this executive government clause in it, because there is this view among constitutional conservatives, and I guess conservatives more broadly, that having that element of executive government in there will open a pathway to the High Court. So I guess conservatives sort of innately are suspicious of any sort of judicial activism, anything that could transfer power from the Parliament to the courts. And there is this view that by having that in there, you create a pathway in which, if The Voice deems that it is not appropriately given the opportunity to make representations on something, that they can then seek legal recourse to the High Court, and then perhaps the High Court will expand the power of The Voice or find that it has a right to be consulted. So he's of the view, just get rid of it, take that off the table, remove this element of debate or controversy around The Voice, and it will garner much more popularity and support within the broader public. Does he have a hope of getting broader support? No. It will be interesting to see how many coalition MPs even support this amendment, given that he's putting it forward alone as a private member and not the coalition. The coalition isn't putting it forward.
Yeah, and we should clarify, just to be really picky, that Julian Leeser himself doesn't have a problem with The Voice making representations to executive government, but he does think it'll be easier to get over the line with sort of more conservative voters if they just get rid of that clause.
Yes.
Let's talk about the tone of the debate so far, which is already making some people feel a bit nervous. David, were you surprised that Peter Dutton came out so stridently with such strong language that was really invoking race right from the get-go?
No. His campaign is to heighten the sense of division. So that's where he's going to go, and I think this has been clear since he chose at the beginning of this year actually to go hard on The Voice. He could have gone harder in January and February on issues like cost of living, but he's been really hammering the issue of The Voice for a long time now. And I think his language will get sharper, and his warnings about division, what Anthony Albanese called catastrophising, will get louder. I think he's made a basic calculation here, and we'll talk, I think, also about the polls. They do show weakening support for the yes side, a sense of momentum, I guess, for the no side. Whether that's enough to tip the balance before the final vote, who knows? But his calculation as leader of the opposition is that it will reward him to go hard. He's got a chance to destroy The Voice, and so that's the explanation for his harsh language here. He's come under criticism for being basically over the top with his language, but you've got to understand his calculation there. He believes that that is going to tap into anxiety about The Voice, and it could work. And I think history does tell us that legalistic disputes can kill referendums, and here we've got dispute, doubt, division, and that can be lethal to the Yes campaign.
Lisa, when you speak to Indigenous advocates for The Voice, do they express concern about the tone of the debate and how it will affect First Nations people, ordinary First Nations people?
Yes, they do express that concern. And I think there's been a recognition by the government about the toll that this debate will take on Indigenous people. They put $10 million in the recent budget for additional mental health services for First Nations people, specifically around the referendum. But, it's not just Indigenous people who are saying this. I mean, we saw the boss of the ABC, David Anderson, saying that he is concerned about his First Nations staff, particularly the ones that have a public-facing profile, about the level of abuse and racist vitriol that they may be subjected to in the lead-up to the referendum. And, of course, that ties in with what we've seen with Stan Grant in recent weeks. Katie Gallagher yesterday in the Senate was talking about how there's been an uptick in racism and sort of racist comments directed at parliamentarians and public servants off the back of The Voice. So there's a brewing problem here that we can imagine is only going to intensify. I would say on the other side of things, the no proponents, they also point to some of the personal attacks that have come from the yes side as an example of the way the tone has descended as well. Comments by Noel Pearson attacking Mickey Gooda earlier in the week, some of that sort of stuff. So it's very worrying the direction it's going in at this point.
Mm.
There's one other aspect of that, which is, of course, the media debate, or the debate about what the media should be doing. And we've seen that certainly with the case of Stan Grant and the ABC. I've been talking to the moderators on our own publications about how we handle that, because when we write about The Voice, we get a lot of feedback from readers in our comments field, and we've got to manage that. I think others in the media are not managing those comments as well as they could, whereas our moderators, they're trying to make sure that they stop, personal, abusive, racist commentary getting into the debate. It's a job for all of us, I think.
Yeah, we're definitely having a moment of reckoning in the media over that. I want to ask you, David, are there many Liberals who will campaign for yes? We've seen a few dissenters from the party line, but they haven't been particularly vocal or particularly central at this point, have they?
I don't think there'll be many of them that will campaign for yes. The coalition is mostly locked in on the no side. I think that Julian Leeser will campaign for yes once the dust has settled and this has gone through Parliament. I think that others are actually making a calculation at the moment. And it's not easy for them, I think. One thing you've got to realise is that, a Liberal who splits from Peter Dutton on this question is a very lonely figure. So I think some of them will bide their time before they decide how assertively they will campaign, how publicly they'll campaign.
Mm. Of course, this whole thing is not going to be decided in Canberra. It's going to be decided in the Australian community. So let's just forget about Canberra for a minute. David, what do our polls say about community support for The Voice and how it's travelling over time?
They show that it's falling, and they show that it's falling steadily, and they show that across multiple polls backed by multiple media outlets. But polls move around, and I think you've just got to look at the trend. It's not good for the yes side. So I think they express confidence that they can get there in the end. But I think a lot is riding on, as you say, what's happening outside Parliament. We're going to get a couple of more weeks of debate inside federal Parliament. But the real activity happens after that vote in the Senate to clear the bill. This bill simply sets up the mechanism for the referendum. Then the yes side has to campaign hard. They say they've got thousands of volunteers. They say they're taking an approach that says they're going to open conversations with people to change their mind, a little bit like the same-sex marriage postal vote. That's their strategy. And I'm not convinced that they've actually got a powerful campaign that's up to the challenge at the moment. I'm a wait and see on that. I really think that we've got to wait and see in July if they can, amass huge amounts of momentum to win the day.
Lisa, for a referendum to get over the line, we obviously need a majority of people in a majority of states. So talking about the campaigning, which states will the yes and no campaigns focus on, do you expect?
Well, it's interesting. You hear Warren Mundine, one of the leading figures in the no campaign, say all the time, we just need to flip 3 states. Even if the majority of Australians at large vote in favour of it, if you don't get a majority of states, it goes down. So you can see already that that's going to be their strategy. They are going to focus on Queensland, WA, The conventional wisdom is that they are the two weakest states, and I think there's a bit of polling around that backs that up. And then it becomes a matter of what is the third state. At this point, Tasmania is the one that is discussed as most likely the third state that could flip, followed by South Australia. If you concentrate your resources in either of those places, that's where you can potentially sink this thing.
It's like a marginal seat campaign. That's the way it's been likened to me by one of the Yes campaign strategists. In a federal election, you concentrate on a marginal seat and try to swing it. Here it's a bit the same, and Tasmania, I think, is the ultimate swing state marginal seat. It's small, you can throw a lot of resources at it and have a big impact when you look at the need for a double majority.
David, one of the arguments we've seen out of Parliament this week has been around this exceptionalism claim that it's somehow going to elevate one race above other people in the Constitution. Do you think that's a compelling argument, and do you think that there is a good response to it?
I wouldn't call it a compelling argument, but I think it would be wise to regard it as a powerful argument. It's an argument that taps into anxiety, taps into, I guess, maybe feelings of jealousy even. This concern, it's always there in public life and certainly there in politics, that other people are getting ahead and I'm not. So it taps into that sense of disadvantage. And that can be very powerful for the No campaign. I think the answer to that argument has been very measured and very, and actually maybe compelling is the word for this. The answer to that argument is, well, just look at Indigenous Australians now. Do they look to you like they're privileged in any way? I mean, they have the worst rates for infant mortality, school leaving. As Anthony Albanese said in Parliament, they've got a higher chance of going to jail than going to university, a young Indigenous person. I mean, that really wakes everybody up, I think.
Yeah. Lise, one of the arguments put against that exceptionalism claim is that we already have a race power in the Constitution, which is Section 51. Most people won't be that intimate with the Constitution, but people say we already have this power. It's only ever been used to make laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So if we're going to have that power and use it, we may as well consult the people about those laws. Is that just kind of getting too much into the weeds, though? Do you think if people are trying to argue over certain powers in the Constitution and certain sections in the Constitution?
I think so, absolutely. I mean, that exact argument there was one that was made by Liberal MP Bridget Archer when she gave her speech on the bill this week. She's one of the few proponents of the voice inside the Liberal Party. But yeah, I mean, part of the issue with this debate is you're going to have to teach Australians about the Constitution and what's in it, really as a starting point. I think the strongest arguments either side of this debate are going to be the emotional appeal to people's, better angels, I suppose.
And just finally, we've already seen major sporting codes come out in favour of the voice. Most recently, the Rugby Union has announced its support. Are we likely to see most of corporate Australia and big institutions like universities declare a stance one way or the other on the voice, or are they going to go neutral?
I'm not sure it matters. I mean, I thought early on that it would be really important to have high-profile sporting stars, known Australian identities, support the voice, because I think that endorsement from sort of significant figures in Australian life is really important. But when I talk to some of the strategists, they think it's much more important to have everyday conversations, to get their thousands of volunteers out to knock on doors and to have conversations with individual voters, that it's kind of won on the streets of Australia. I'm not sure either way, to be honest, but I don't think it matters much that a university endorses the voice. I think it's won in the suburbs and communities.
Shoe leather activism. Thank you both very much for joining us. It's such an important topic, and I'm sure we'll come back together to talk about it again as the debate rolls on. Thank you so much, Lisa and David.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you, Jackie.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong, with technical assistance from Debbie Harrington. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jacqueline Maley. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm
I'm Eddie Maguire. This is Brownlow medalist, Premiership superstar Jimmy Bartel, also a board member of GWS. Isn't it a conflict of interest?
Conflicts of everywhere, and I think you and I might have a few conflicts if you keep going that way. Make sure you join us every Monday because we will talk about all the big issues that you want to hear about the fans.
And we want you to get involved as well. It's Eddie and Jimmy on the podcast. Richard is our producer. Richard, how do you find us, mate?
Subscribe to Eddie and Jimmy wherever you get your podcasts.
There it is.